Hello and welcome to Bicycling in the US. Thank you for joining us. We're very excited to be talking today about all things participation. First off, want to tell you all just a couple of housekeeping bits. We will be recording this, so don't feel like you have to take screenshots. We will be sending this recording and the deck to you afterwards. You are all automatically muted. If you do have questions, please drop them in the Q&A. We'll be monitoring that heavily. If you have chat amongst yourselves, feel free to use the chat function as well. And we will have at least 15 minutes at the end. And if we don't get to your question, we'll try to follow up with you afterwards. And if we don't, please email us at any time. And without further ado, I will tell you a little bit about myself. I am Liam Donahue. If you don't know me, I am the fairly new, almost a year now, bicycle industry senior research manager for People4Bikes. Joined last June, and I handle all things data and research over here at PFB. Spent about 12 years before that at Workstand, and yeah, love bikes, raced bikes. Super excited to talk about people riding bikes. Jen.
Hey everyone, Jennifer Boldry. I'm a senior group director at Naxion, which is a market intelligence firm, but also lucky enough to serve as the chief research advisor for People4Bikes. Been doing bike industry related research for almost 20 years. And Liam, I have to say, I think I've said to you before, but I'm so excited about this webinar because I feel like we've had to deliver a lot of not great news so far this year for the bike industry. And I'm happy that as far as participation goes, there's a lot of really good news.
Agreed. Things are very good on this front.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about our data sources to begin with. So Liam and I together run the research and statistics subcommittee for People4Bikes. That's the committee that collects and distributes all the market intelligence for the bike industry, all of the stuff you see on the Business Intelligence Hub, which is free to members, and includes the People4Bikes participation study and collecting participation data from elsewhere. Our theme for the Research and Stats Subcommittee from here on out is all about triangulation, bringing together multiple data points to really understand kind of a whole picture of how things are going. And, thrilled that this is kind of our first webinar where we get to do that. I mean, we've been doing that with the Nerd Collective, Liam, I feel like for a while now, the BLC and other places, but this is the first time we've done it with participation. And I'm excited about that. So let me just talk a little bit about the data sources. So People4Bikes does run a bicycling specific participation study that is an online survey fielded to the general population of Americans ages 3 plus, where parents answer for kids under 18. We collect about 16,000 interviews per year, and we run that every other year. We've been doing that since 2014. Typically fields in the fall, and it's specifically, again, designed to accurately understand as much as we can with self-reported data participation trends in the United States. A similar study has been fielding since 2007. It's called the Physical Activity Council, PAC for short. And the PAC is a group of organizations who are interested in measuring all kinds of outdoor and physical activities in the US. So, Outdoor Industry Association, Sports and Fitness Industry Association, the Football Association, which the name I don't have written down and I can't do. Liam, do you remember what the name of that organization is?
I can't right now.
Yeah. And we have tennis, we have golf, we have football, we have snow sports, like all of the trade organizations for those industries come together, pool our money, and run this study that collects data continuously throughout the year. It's also online surveys, also field to a general population sample, but includes kids 6 plus instead of 3 plus. Parents do answer for kids under 13 and sit with kids 13 plus when they're taking it. So that's, pretty similar to what we do with the People4Bikes study. Physical Activity Council collects about 18,000 surveys per year and measures more than 120 outdoor and fitness related activities. So really similar methodologies, except that People4Bikes goes a little bit younger And we do that because of balance bikes. We think that that's hitting a pretty small or a pretty young kind of group of people. And we only run every other year where Physical Activity Council runs, every year. So both of those studies were designed specifically to get at how many people are riding in the US and who those people are. Not so much to understand kind of the motivators behind riding or not riding. We'll talk a little bit about that. But we will be able to give some pretty good, I think, hypotheses around why these trends are going. We don't always have the answers from these studies to answer the why question super definitively, but I think we've got some other data points that help us understand that. So we'll talk about that. Then the third data point we're going to talk about today comes from EcoCounter. Our partners at EcoCounter, for those of you who aren't familiar, EcoCounter are the counters that are put out on bike trails and paths that count how many bikes ride over. So it's not the number of riders in the way that the Physical Activity Council and PeopleForBikes, but it is the number of rides that kind of hit those counters. And they can, based on trends, time of day, day of week, and et cetera, parse out recreation and transportation riding. And they have been kind enough to partner with us using a sample of over 100 counters, kind of representatively distributed across regions in the US, to create an index that tells us how much the number of rides they're measuring has changed year over year. So it's not exactly the same, but is a really interesting data point to help us understand the whole story.
And we actually just got a question about if there's a technical report available. And so these studies are available in our member center. If you are a member, go to the member center. You will find both the PFB and PAC studies, as well as all of the historical archives. And then they're also available on the resource marketplace if you are not a member. And then that EcoCounter data is currently only available to members on our Business Intelligence Hub.
Thanks, Liam.
Yes.
All right, let's talk about overarching trends. So what's happening kind of in general with participation? And as we go through each of these, we're going to start with the PeopleForBikes study, then we're going to go to the Physical Activity Council, and then we're going to go to EcoCounter. So if you go to the next one. So what you'll see here, and when you get the slide deck, keep this in mind. If there's a little PFB icon in the corner, it's based on the PFB participation study. We have put that in the title too, but PFB and PAC are so close together. We were kind of worried about getting confused. So this is the overall participation rate according to the PeopleForBikes participation study. And what I mean by overall participation rate is that it's the number of Americans who have ridden at least one day in the last 12 months outdoors. Again, self-reported. What we see here is that 2014 was a bit higher. Kind of we saw a drop to 2016. That, and when we're interpreting these trends, please keep in mind that a change from one year to another year is not necessarily a trend. We like to see at least 3 years of the same pattern before we talk about a trend. But certainly since 2016, we've seen an increase in the proportion of Americans who ride a bike at least one day in the last 12 months. This year, 2024, it's 35% of Americans 3+, which is, over a third, and that's the highest we've seen since starting this. And I think what I find most exciting about that is that it means that all of the extra ridership we got in the pandemic wasn't the high point. We've not only kept those riders, but we've continued to grow the participation base, and that's pretty exciting. If we go to the next one, you'll see the riding trends for the Physical Activity Council participation study. And although there's a little blip there, drop in 2023 that you see, this is also the percentage of Americans 6+ who've ridden at least one day in the past 12 months outdoors. But we see that same, since 2016, we see that same trend in growth over time. The percentage of Americans who are riding has continued to increase. So we're seeing the same pattern. You might be thinking to yourself, as I would if I were in your shoes, how come these numbers are so much lower, right? That, we're not in the 30%, right? We're in about a quarter, mid 20%, not too far off 30% as we're moving into 2024, but those are lower than what we see in the People for Bikes study. And there's really two reasons for that. One is Physical Activity Council does not explicitly include transportation riding, given the scope of that study and that it's mostly about fitness and recreation activities. It's reasonable to assume people are maybe not reporting their transportation riding. And the second piece is that because the Physical Activity Council measures so many different kinds of activities, there's probably some respondent fatigue there. So when we think about triangulation, the way that we treat these two studies is, we like to see the same trend. We're a little bit suspicious if we don't see a similar trend over time. And again, that's more than a 1 year period. But we wouldn't expect to see the same numbers. When we're thinking in terms of absolute value, we tend to focus on the People for Bikes participation study because it's specifically designed to measure bicycling, all types of bicycling. So that's kind of how we think about it. And the next one. Okay, so this is the eco-counter results. It looks a little bit different, again, because this is an index versus last year. So we can see that 2019 is the benchmark year that we're indexing again. So it's right at 100. And anytime a year is over that 100 mark, it means participation or the numbers of rides that they have recorded in those comparable locations that we talked about that are representative regionally over the US. It means the number of rides is up versus 2019. If we drop below that 100 points, it means that the number of rides they're measuring is down versus 2019. So you can see here that they saw a little dip according to EcoCounter in about 2022. But that ridership has generally been on an increase since 2019. And in fact, in 2024, seeing the highest number we've seen since we started working with EcoCounter in 2019. So all of these are really positive. Again, we do see slightly different, dips and ebbs and flows in particular years in these different studies. But what we do see is across the studies is a pretty consistent pattern of growth. And so we feel pretty good in concluding that, in fact, bicycling is growing in the country and has been even post-pandemic, which again, is pretty exciting for us. So Liam, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you talk a little bit about, what are some of the things that are driving, this growth in ridership that we're seeing.
Yeah, thanks. And first, I'm going to take this question just because we're on it right now. Carmen had asked what cities are represented by EcoCounter and are they nationally representative? And yes, they are. So if you are a member and you go to our member center, you can actually dig into some of the regional data to see, I think it's broken out into 6 regions. And comparison and trends over time for those regions. So it is nationally representative. What it's not necessarily representative of are non-cities, right? And so that's kind of one piece. But yeah, anytime we're talking about participation, it's sort of how many people are riding and how often are they riding. And so one of the big pieces that we're very excited about, and that, again, to Jen's point earlier, that we are excited to be sharing news rather than maybe not as excited, is the age factor. If you've been paying attention or you receive any emails from us, you have probably seen that we saw a very nice jump in youth participation. So again, reminder, the People for Bikes study looks at kids from 3 up, and we saw after a decline from 2014 to about 2022, youth ridership was declining, and there are several reasons that we postulate why, but we were very happy to see that in 2024 there was this pretty big rebound right here. And so when we look at what's happening on the adult level all the way, 18 plus, not as much growth. And so what we see is the big area of growth is really happening in that youth level. The other thing to note is that when we think about trends, we also want to think about changing demographics over time out into the future. And we know that kids are projected to make up a smaller proportion of the US population in the future as birth rates kind of are declining.
And at this point, Liam, too, I'd probably jump in and just say, we're not at the point where we can definitively say there's a
Okay.
trend of growth in kids ridership. But it's still a really exciting finding. And I think, as we kind of look at the pack and we look at others and think about some of the reasons for that, there have certainly been a number of organizations in the bike industry who've focused on growing, kids riding. And I think about little organizations like Little Bellas and NICA. And I think about, we can talk more about some of the product, developments there have been that have encouraged that. So we're really hopeful that we'll continue to see that pattern over time.
Yes, and we've seen that pattern in a slightly different way, but seen that pattern in the pack participation study as well. We didn't see the declines that we saw in the People for Bikes study, but we do see that increase in kids riding with the last couple of years, kind of since the pandemic, and just a little bit before the pandemic, really seeing that biggest increase. Whereas adults, yeah, there is growth, but you can see it's relatively flat over time. Jen, would you like to talk about what we're seeing in gender?
Sure. So we can break participation up by many things, not just age. We're going to talk about gender. We'll also talk about patterns relative to ethnicity and a couple of other characteristics. But gender is is an important one that we tend to look at. So let's start with the PFB participation study. Um, I think although this looks relatively flat, what we see is that the trend for males and the white line there is actually statistically significant from 2022 to 2024 versus for females, it's not. There's a little bit of growth there, but statistically not significant. Um, it's good. It's good that we're seeing some growth, and I'm very excited about that. It's not necessarily the best news that we're not seeing it across both genders, right? And when I think about that, I think about the influence that females have on their kids. And incidentally, the results for the People for Bikes participation study for gender are filtered only to adults because we didn't want to confound that growth in kids riding necessarily. So when I think about the influence of females, I think about influence of females on the whole family for riding and things like that. There's also some literature that suggests that female ridership might be a good bellwether for how safe people feel. So, we'd certainly like to see the participation rate for females growing as well. If we go to the pack results, thanks, Liam. We do see it's been kind of relatively stable for both genders, but we do see that bump for males here too that we don't necessarily see for females. So we're getting really similar results from pack and People for Bikes in this case. Um, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but one of the other analyses we'll do is how this gender split kind of changes depending on how frequently people ride. And we do see a pattern where, at low frequency riding or very casual riding, the gender split is much closer to 50-50. And then as you move up that enthusiast in terms of frequency to people who are riding like 100 plus times a year, it becomes much more skewed towards males. And that's, a piece of what's going on here. We'll talk about that more in detail in just a minute. So Liam, I'm going to turn it back over to you to talk a little bit about the trends by ethnicity.
Yes, ethnicity and race. And again, we'll in a minute here, we'll see some pretty interesting things in regards to kind of that casual versus core enthusiast. But looking overall at sort of the white Caucasian people riding, we see a fairly flat, a little bit of growth when we look all the way back to 2016 up through 2024. So from 29% back in 2016, we see growth up to about 33% in 2024. And again, this is adults only.
And incidentally, the reason we start with 2026 for this one is not because we don't have that information for 2024,
Yes.
2014, but we changed how we asked about ethnicity. And so it's not really comparable prior to that. So just as a little aside.
And that's a good point. I think maybe you brought it up way at the very beginning, Jennifer, but a big reason we're able to even do all of this trending in the first place is because of the methodology of both of these studies hasn't changed as far as the questions we're asking. So we're able to actually see sort of these trends way back into time. So looking at the PAC study, another increase similar again in kind of overall size from 24% back in 2014, 10 years ago, up to about 28% now, little dips here and there, but overall growth. Um, and that one again includes kids. When we jump here into kind of the minority, we don't see that the growth quite as much, which isn't necessarily the best news. We know, again, talking about kind of demographics, the US is expected to continue to diversify in the future. And so seeing that the Hispanic Latinx population relatively flat, the Black African American population of ridership relatively flat as well. We're basically at the same level that we were there in 2020. Not necessarily the best news. That jump though
Although,
from, yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
I was going to
Yeah.
say, yeah, thanks, Liam. Go ahead.
Yeah, that jump from 2022 up to 2024 is statistically significant. And so that's another kind of point is that some of these very small percentage jumps is not necessarily statistically significant until it gets to a certain size based on the sample that we're looking at. So that is, and so what we hope is, again, to Jennifer's point earlier, we hope that in 2026, with the next one, we see that it continues a trend of growth rather than it's not just kind of one blip or one data point. Looking at the PAC study, fairly similar, although we see a little bit of kind of weirdness going on there in 2014 up through 2016. But looking at that Hispanic Latinx population, we do see some growth. Whereas in the African American population, from 2016 onward, not really much growth. A little bit here in the last couple of years. So again, that's promising. It's sort of we hope that the trend continues, and when we see that the trend continues, that's great. Sort of from 18% in 2016 here to 23% here in 2024. So that's great. For Hispanics, an even bigger jump. And again, there is this kind of those first couple of years, pretty low here in the Hispanic Latinx population, but down at 15% up to 26% in 2024. So overall, the trend is good. Great news for the industry. But again, because we're seeing different patterns between these two studies, we can't necessarily say for sure, that what is going on here in these non-white populations. So either way, we want to diversify the participation base of the industry. So that's still a huge opportunity and another thing that we'll be talking about a lot as we go forward. And related to the point that Jennifer made about gender, groups that ride less frequently tend to be more diverse. So the more casual you are, the more you tend to be diverse and less white. And so as you move up that continuum, the balance shifts more towards whites. And we'll get into that in a minute. But
And
again,
again, and I feel like we'd be remiss not to point out, Liam, too, that one of the reasons this is so important is because when we think about demographic trends in the US, I mean, one of the things we are seeing and that the US Census projects is that the US population is going to get increasingly diverse over time. And to the degree, and I know the bike industry has been thinking about, diversity for a long time. And again, there have been, just like with kids, a number of organizations that have worked really hard, to grow diversity in cycling and had some success. I think it continues to be a really important piece of what we need to think about when we think about growing kind of the participation base as a whole.
yes. And so Jennifer, do you want to talk about, this is the piece about frequency of riding?
Yeah, so we really have two things, and Liam alluded to it a little bit earlier, but we have participation rates, the number of people riding, and then we have how often they ride. And I think in the camp of not so good news, we are seeing the good news is we're seeing more people riding. The not so good news is they're not riding as often. So if you go to the next slide, what we have here in the gray bar is the percentage of those who ride each year who are casual, meaning they ride less than 2 days a month. And we picked, we at People for Bikes just kind of picked that as a cutoff point. We could pick a different cutoff point, and in fact, the Physical Activity Council does, which we'll talk about. And we're defining an enthusiast as anyone who rides 25 plus days per year, which ends up being obviously more than twice a month. And what we see over time, and that's that blue bar. So what we see over time is in 2014, it was just a little over half of the participant base were casual. As we move year over year, this year we saw 60% of that participation base being casual. So though we have more people, that it's really being driven by riders who are not riding quite as often. Now that I mean, I can understand how many folks in the industry might feel like that's concerning, right? It could imply longer replacement cycles. It could imply less need for maintenance, repairs, parts, upgrades. When we talk about it at People for Bikes, I think it's a really big opportunity because we have grown the pie. And it's, when we think about those casual riders, it's much, much easier to get somebody who's already riding to ride more often than it is to get somebody off the couch. So I feel like, even if the growth is being driven by these casual folks, it's a huge opportunity for the industry. And if we go to the next slide, we see exactly the same pattern in the Physical Activity Council participation study. Now, they do define casual and enthusiast a little bit differently. Their measure of casual is quite a bit more broad than ours is. But we see the same pattern where, it's been that casual participation base has been growing since 2014 and is essentially 60-40, here in 2024. So we're seeing exactly the same pattern in both studies, which gives us confidence that that's really happening. We're working on the Outdoor Industry Association is working on their report based on this year's data, and you're going to see something similar for outdoor participation as a whole. But again, for bicycling, I feel like it's just a ton of opportunity for us.
So we spoke about this a little bit, but to really understand then the opportunity with these casual riders, you've got to understand who the casual rider is. And so we were alluding to it, but here are kind of some pretty incredible statistics. I think this is actually really great to look at. So we see casual participants are more likely to be between 18 to 34. They're less likely to be 55 plus, so they're younger. They are more likely to be female. They are more likely to have a kid. Some of this is a little commonsensical, but some of it is also great to see borne out in the data. That's the People for Bikes study. Going to the PAC study, pretty much the same pattern on the age side of things. Core riders tend to be older. Casual riders tend to be younger. Same, little different though here on the male-female side. So we don't see that jump in the casual rider being significantly more female. The other thing too is that I think you're probably going to say it, Jennifer, because you are the statistician. We're both dorks, but you are going to bring in the dorky point about that is very important. That we don't have the statistical testing, so we don't have the raw data here, so we can't necessarily say whether these or how these are or aren't statistically significant.
But I think it's fair to say a difference between 22 and 38 is probably a meaningful difference. I mean, especially when we look at the statistical significance. Again, one of the reasons that triangulation is really important. But I do have to say, Liam, are you saying I'm dorkier than you are? Because maybe.
No, not dorkier than I am. You were
Okay.
just going to refer to something that is dorky, and that is all.
Okay.
Continuing kind of the trend, and again, what we sort of mentioned earlier is that the casual rider is less likely to be white. And so these little arrows that you see also are the kind of indicators of statistical significance. They're less likely to be white, more likely to be black, less likely to be high income, more likely to be low income. Again, some of that sort of makes sense, but pretty clear and pretty evident in the data. The PAC data tells a very similar story. Same sort of pattern that we're seeing. More likely to be lower income, less likely to be higher income, and then similar on that less likely to be white.
And I just, before we go to the next piece, maybe flip back one more.
Yeah.
I just want to say that one of the reasons that this analysis is important is not because you'd necessarily ever ask your customer, like if you're an industry company or retailer, you might not ask your customers about their annual income, or you might not know so much about them. But if we as an industry are going to think about how do we expand the participation base? How do we continue to grow it? It's really important to know who the people are, right? Because a strategy for understanding how to gain ridership among women or among people of color might be really different. Like the channels that you'd go to or the messages that you'd provide or even the messengers, might be really different depending on the kind of people you're trying to target, right? And so it's really important to understand these if we're going to be successful in growing the ridership over time. All right. I mentioned earlier, we don't know a lot about the whys behind a lot of this. We've thrown out some hypotheses about some of these and things like that. But we do have in the PFB participation study a little bit of attitudinal data where we ask people how much they agree with a series of statements about their riding behavior. So you can see, and I'm going to have Liam's got control of the little highlighter, so I'm going to have him circle these as we go along. There are some really interesting attitudinal differences between our casual participants and enthusiasts. Casual participants are significantly less likely to say they're familiar with bicycle lanes, significantly less likely to see bicycling as a convenient way to get from one place to another, which kind of makes sense if they're maybe not as familiar, less likely to say they're satisfied with the bike network in their area, and also less likely to say they feel more safe riding a bicycle than they did 5 years ago. And so we can see maybe some of the things that might be barriers. There might be a familiarity, comfort, convenience barrier that's going on here. And that could be twofold. Like it could be the case that truly, there's not a very good bike network, or it could be that they don't know about the bike network. So it could be a combo of, for sure, we need better infrastructure and better networks. And we also need to find good ways to make sure, especially casual riders, know where these places are so that they feel like it's, a real option for them, whether it's recreation or transportation, right? Equally interesting to me about this whole scenario are the things that kind of aren't statistically different for casuals and enthusiast riders. I would like to ride a bike more often. Almost 70% of both groups say that. And so that's really good news going back to the opportunity that we maybe have to get some of these casual riders riding more often. It's not lack of will, right? They want to do it. How can we make it easy for that to be an option for them to ride more often? Casuals and enthusiasts are equally likely to say that they would be more likely to ride if motor vehicles and bikes are physically separated, and equally likely to say they worry about being hit by a motor vehicle when riding. And so it's not that enthusiasts necessarily feel more safe. It's just that they're doing it anyway. And so I think the important piece to that for me is if we can build better bike networks, we can make them more accessible. Not only are we going to help casual riders ride more often, but we're probably actually going to help our enthusiasts ride more often as well, which is, good for everyone, right? Liam, did I miss anything? Is there anything in there you see that I didn't mention?
No, you hit it all. I think, yeah, those are pretty interesting. And so that's a kind of a good segue then into sort of what's the opportunity? Like what is the takeaway, or what are some of the takeaways from here? So there are, the broad economic indicators here that we're seeing with everything that is going on with the bad news that we've been delivering, and just some of the uncertainty economically with the tariffs and everything else. There is this opportunity that we are sitting kind of on a participation gold mine. Um,
And if I could just jump in and say, stick with us for this one, because when you start to see some of these charts, you're going to I think to yourself, like, wait, how is this related to participation? But stick with us just for a few minutes, and I think you'll see where we're going with this. I think I'm going to give, if it's okay, Liam, give away the punchline before we get into the details. But the punchline is, when the COVID hit, we didn't know what was going to happen, right? We didn't know that was going to be such a boon for the industry, both for participation and for sales. We are seeing some of the same indicators right now relative to participation. The sales indicators aren't so good, but the participation indicators are pretty interesting that suggest that we might be moving into another period where, we might be able to have a chance to sort of pour lighter fluid on a trend towards higher participation. So stick with us and we'll give you some detail about how we're getting to that conclusion.
Yes. So these slides are coming to you from, we shared these at the Bicycle Leadership Conference back in March. But so, yeah, despite all of that good news that we've been mentioning on the participation side, the industry sales continue to be challenging. There's maybe some good news coming in March when you see the next sell-through email here in the next few days, but it's really, we're still facing headwinds. And so it's challenging. Sales are struggling. Inventory hasn't sold through like we were hoping. The tariffs, the threat of tariffs, the uncertainty around whether they'll be here or not be here or be X% or Y%, has been having a huge impact. And so, yeah, here we just see the size of each of these bike categories, and they're down. Almost all of them down over last year, pretty significantly.
And you maybe pointed this out, Liam, but these data are from Circana, and they are data that that Liam and the Nerd Collective presented at the Bicycle Leadership Conference,
Yes.
as are kind of all of the data you're about to see are from the Bicycle Leadership Conference. So we have not updated them to include like Q1 data because it's really looking at 2024 versus 2023. But I think Liam's point, the point of it is what Liam said just at the end there, which is, certainly we have some concerns about sales.
Yes. And yeah, Tristan just asked a question, and yes, the reason that road maybe looks better than every other category there is because it does include gravel, and we've been seeing growth in gravel.
Yep.
But we're going to kind of skip over that and continue on to focus on this next piece. So this one's from Workstand. And this is really looking at the Workstand online orders in blue. And then the line that's going across is the actual durable goods buying conditions. And so that's a piece that comes out of the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey. It has a bunch of different index components, and that's the one that's specific for, are people willing to buy, are the conditions ripe for buying durable goods? And so if you kind of just look at what that number was at in the Q1 of 2024 relative to what it has been, and again, we didn't update this with March or April numbers, but significantly lower starting the year off. So that's a pretty big deal. To the point Jennifer was just making, we don't necessarily think that we're going to see that COVID boom in sales, but again, stick with us. We saw those just the orders that then ended up happening throughout the summer were really tamped a little bit. We didn't see kind of the spike that we would normally see. And so the assumption is, with that durable goods being even lower than it was, well, that might mean that the orders, once the selling season starts here in March, April, May, might be even lower than previously.
And Liam, if I could just jump in, I
Yes.
actually looked at the University of Michigan sentiment right before we got on this to see kind of what we're seeing, more recently. And I think the first important point I would make about this is that, that household durable buying conditions is correlated with workstand online orders. We didn't correlate that with brick and mortar, but it is correlated with the online orders. And the results of the University of Michigan customer sentiment index, since then have not been good. They've continued to decline over time and are at a pretty low point right now. I think the lowest that we've seen, I'm going to read this to you, the steepest 3 month percentage decline seen since the 1990 recession. Concern about inflation continues to grow. So there are some economic pressures here that I think, we do have to pay attention to for sure.
And then just kind of one last one. So this, based on Circana data, consumers weren't spending on the durables, but they did spend on some categories. So in 2024, we see, home decor up six, almost 7%, prestige beauty up 6%, home textiles, housewares, a lot of um, what Matt Tucker at Circana termed the nesting related categories. And so what does this mean then for the bike industry? Well, we bring up the sort of the challenges because we were, like Jen said, we were so busy during COVID trying to meet this very wildly unanticipated demand. It was also just strange times. We weren't prepared for what was coming. And so then when everybody got tired of staying home, all of a sudden, boom, bikes were being bought, bikes were being ridden. What all of these indicators are maybe suggesting is that although we won't see that product demand, we won't see this huge need for more and more and more bikes because of the economic pressure that is currently out there. We probably will see that folks aren't going to be spending their money on other forms of entertainment. What we saw during the pandemic and we're likely to see again is that summer travel migrates from air travel back to more often car travel. And when people travel by car, they often take bikes. Just spending in general can be suppressed during periods like this. So people will look to experiences and things and forms of recreation maybe that they already have gear for. So maybe they already bought a bike, maybe they'll buy a new one. But the fact is that they're more likely to ride, especially if they maybe hadn't last year, to get those bikes out of the garage that they already have. And so just like it's easier to sell, anyone who's been in retail knows, it's easier to sell something to a customer you already have who's already bought something from you. It's easier to get people who are already riding a little bit to ride more than it is to get someone totally off the couch to get into cycling. And so it really is kind of the perfect time to focus on how do we get those casual riders riding more often. There's a huge number of them, 60-40. How do we do that?
Yeah, and not to put too fine a point on it, but this is where I get, kind of super excited about the opportunity. Granted, the economic indicators are not great as far as buying bikes or other kinds of discretionary things, right? I mean, the spending over the next bit of time might not be great. But when that happens in concert with these other indicators like the nesting, when people nest, it's not too long before they're looking for inexpensive ways to get back outside again or, out of their houses again. This close to home travel is always really good for things like biking and camping, right? Because people can easily throw a bike in a car or on a car versus a plane. And so all of these things together suggest to me that, while we might struggle to sell bikes, we have a real opportunity to get more people riding them more often.
Do you have any last little things to add, Jennifer, or shall we just move straight to the Q&A?
I think we want to move to the Q&A, and I want to address one thing just kind of right off the front. Pete said in the chat, he said similar to a Got Milk campaign, right? And so I think, Pete, you're definitely kind of picking up what we're laying down here in terms of the opportunity to grow participation. I will say, while the Got Milk campaign was super successful from the level of kind of public
Awareness.
consciousness,
Yeah.
yeah, it didn't actually grow the amount of milk sold or consumed in the United States. So one could argue that it, maybe wasn't effective for the behavior change it was looking for. But I will say we have lots of tools that might be super effective for that. Certainly in the market research world, when we're talking about selling things, a lot of people go to social media and social media influencers. But, maybe we could sell bicycle riding as a product. It's good for you, it's good for the climate. I think one of the things we don't talk about as much as we should is the mental health benefits, especially when times are stressful. And, no matter which side of the fence you sit on, times are stressful and unpredictable, right? And so getting outside and, riding bikes can be one really good and inexpensive way to cope with some of that stress. When we think about the benefits for kids, but there are, I talked about some kids programs earlier. One I didn't mention was Outride, specifically focused on using bicycles in a school setting to help combat ADHD and other kinds of attention related, struggles that kids have in schools. And there's lots of really good research in neuropsychology that supports the benefit of bicycling for things like that. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a ton of opportunity for that and really excited about it.
Jen, you know what? I'm going to jump real quick because I believe we only had this scheduled for 45. So we're going to jump very quickly to key takeaways, and then we're going to come back. We're going to stay on for anyone who can and answer as many questions as we can. But want to
Yep.
just bring home these key takeaways that more Americans are riding bikes than at any other time that we've been tracking. So that's obviously the number one point. What I was talking about on kids riding, it's kids, more kids are riding. We don't necessarily know if it's a trend. We hope that it is. And there are a lot of confounding variables with smartphones and everything else. But the other piece then is that casual versus core. So we know that casual riding is driving growth and that casual riders really differ in many key ways from enthusiasts. And so how do we leverage these findings to grow the base of cycling? That's the big question. And we were going to end on that, but instead, we're going to end on that, give you 5 seconds to think about it, and then we're going to jump back into Q&A. And if you have to jump off, thank you so much. If you can stick around, please do. And again, we'll be sending this recording out. So one question that Tim Akers brought up that is certainly top of mind, we were just talking about it this morning, is are we thinking that bike sales are being pulled forward due to tariff concerns, due to the thought of price increases? Yes, we do. We haven't seen all of the April data yet, but kind of preliminary April data from Workstand suggests that at least in the e-commerce world, yeah, it looks as though folks are. But we know that a big chunk, a lot of the casual riders maybe aren't as attuned to what the price increases might be. They're not always thinking, maybe I should buy a new bike this year. So we suspect that yes, there is a lot of that pull forward effect. What we don't know, and we'll have to wait until May for, is how much is being pulled forward.
Yeah, and let me field a question then from On Lee, who asked, in the various participation studies, are there any indicators or inference on the type of riding or types of bikes, like e-bikes versus other bikes? So first, I want to say thanks, On, for asking the question. And I also want to let everyone know On Lee is our new board chair for PFB. So thanks, On, for not only asking questions, but everything you do for us. We really appreciate the support. The participation studies break out EcoCounter breaks out recreation and transportation based on like the pattern of riding, time of day, day of week, etc. So we can look at that separately. Our participation study, the PFB and the PAC, PFB breaks out transportation and recreation. PAC breaks out road/paved, unpaved/mountain, and then BMX. So we can do a little bit of self-report on type of riding. It's hard to get too far down in it only because people have to self-report it. And, especially for casual riders, like it can be hard to, well, are you, cross-country mountain biking, or are you, you can't really get into that details. The other complicating factor in the US at least, almost all riding is recreation. And so, we tend not to have a huge sample size when it comes to looking at transportation riding. But I will say on type of bike, we do have the sales metrics from Circana on what types of bikes are being ridden. And I think it's a strong hypothesis that some of the growth in kids' bikes is probably due to e-bikes, especially the pervasive kind of bench throttle e-bikes we're seeing go through, Costco and other parts of those big box stores. The product matters a lot. And I think we're seeing the percentage of bikes sold that are e-bikes growing over time. So I think we do see strong demand for e-bikes, and that's definitely an opportunity to help broaden the participation base.
And it's a good point to bring up too. Kristen Bennett had asked, or had mentioned that some folks will overlap the eco counter data with manual data collection. There's also technology out there with video collection, so you're able to sit there and look and see what people are riding. So there's certainly ways that can be improved as that technology increases, as far as being able to determine. I was talking to our contact, David at EcoCounter, that they'll have technology that might be able to determine without as much manual work what type of bike is being ridden. Let's see. We also had Russell Chandler. How much of the increase in kids' bike purchases are with bike shops versus online e-bike sales? Seems like there's been a decline in kids on regular bikes purchased from an IBD. Yeah, that's hard for me to necessarily say right now, because I'd have to dig into the data a little bit. But we know that, so we did just release direct to consumer sales for the first time ever back in March at the BLC. And so we now have a little bit of historical data going back to 2024 for what's happening in the kind of direct to consumer world. So there, and that is almost all e-bikes, something like 70, I think, percent, or maybe 70+% of the DTC market is e-bikes. And we know that a lot of those certainly are kids' bikes. Don't know if that all the way answers your question, Russell, but thank you for asking. And feel free to reach back out for more. Follow up on that. On the cycling, Jeff O'Coin, on the cycling equipment decline chart, were e-bikes broken down by category? And so no, on that one, they were not. Let me go back. This is just, the entire kind of bucket of e-bikes. And so to the point you're making, like, there is a lot to be looked at as far as, well, what specific type of e-bike is maybe driving the decline, or what types of e-bikes are maybe growing. And that is certainly something like consult the Circana sell-through data that we put out every month, because that is going to definitely get into more and more about whether it's lifestyle e-bikes compared to mountain e-bikes.
And I think worth noting, for those of you who are interested in breaking out sales by different types of bicycles, members get access to monthly top line data from PFB that's available also on the Business Intelligence Hub. And so if you're interested in that, we do provide that for members.
And yes, David, I can't remember the exact amount. There are a lot of numbers floating in my head right now, but it's something like 70% of D2C are e-bikes. And the vast, vast majority, like 98% of those e-bikes, are throttle-driven e-bikes. Demographic trends, that you kind of answered that, Jennifer, about conventional versus e-bikes. That's one piece I know that we the PAC participation study you mentioned kind of gets at it, where it's looking at, or it's asking everyone who says, yes, I ride mountain bikes, and then it's asking, okay, well, do you ride an e-bike? Again, you can't necessarily get at how often are you riding your e-bike versus your analog bike, because maybe you have one of each. So there's certainly room to learn a lot from there, and then also plenty of room to try to learn more. Well, Jen, you're muted.
Sorry about that. My laptop strangely mutes randomly every once in a while. So let me just say thank you to everyone for having spent some of their time listening to us talk about participation. Liam and I, as he mentioned earlier, are really both nerds. We get pretty excited about this stuff. But really, I mean, really, this participation growth is something we should A, be proud of, and B, be really excited about. So thank you, everyone. We'll be following up with the deck and recording. Really appreciate the time. Liam, anything else before we stop?
No, but just a quick thanks to Peter for jumping into the chat there, because of course he's there to answer with the exact numbers. Thank you, Peter. But yes, that the main takeaways, like we said, are just that there are some very important things going on in ridership and in participation right now. So we really just have to capitalize on it because it's going to hopefully continue through the rest of the year and into next year. Thank you
Great.
all.
Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your week.